The wind rolled across the empty prairie, carrying with it the dry scent of winter grass and the faint cry of a distant coyote. Inside a small, weather-worn house, a lone rancher stirred the embers of his fire and listened to the restless night. His days were all the same, marked by hard work and quiet meals, with only the crack of a fence post or the shuffle of his boots to break the silence. He had chosen this life years ago, when loss and disappointment made the company of others feel more painful than the ache of solitude. The walls of his cabin held no family photographs, no children's laughter, only the steady rhythm of a man who had learned to depend on no one but himself. He had mended fences until his hands hardened like the wood he worked, and he had built his days into a sturdy routine that kept the past from creeping in. That evening the cold settled early, pushing a thin sheet of frost across the windows and painting the horizon in shades of fading blue. He finished his supper of beans and bread, wiped his plate clean, and leaned back in his chair to listen to the wind. The house creaked as it cooled, a sound he had heard countless times before, yet tonight it felt sharper, more expectant, as if the night itself was holding its breath. He rose to add another log to the fire, the glow lighting the rough lines of his face, when a sudden knock rattled the door. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the firm rap of a friend. It was quick, urgent, a sound that belonged to someone who carried a need too heavy to wait. For a moment he stood still, his hand frozen on the back of the chair. No one came out this far after dark. The nearest ranch lay miles away, and travelers rarely risked the lonely road once the sun had dropped. Another knock followed, sharper this time, and the wind seemed to hush around it. He set his jaw, reached for the iron latch, and pulled the door open. There, framed by the pale light of a rising moon, stood a woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her coat was dusted with snow, her face marked by travel and worry. At her side clung two children, a boy and a girl, their cheeks flushed with cold and eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. The boy's small boots were worn through at the toes, and the girl's mitten hung loose from a frayed string. Behind them the prairie stretched empty and silent, a vast dark sea beneath a sky scattered with icy stars. The woman met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised him. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of miles walked and decisions made. "They ain't yours," she said, each word measured and clear, "but they need you." The words hung in the cold air between them, simple and impossible all at once. He looked from the woman to the children, searching for some sign of explanation. He had never seen them before, of that he was certain. Yet the children's eyes, wide and unblinking, held something that stirred an old ache deep inside him. The boy tightened his grip on the woman's skirt, while the girl hugged a small bundle of cloth to her chest, as if it contained the last of her warmth. The rancher felt the night pressing in around them, the wind biting harder, the weight of their presence heavier than the cold. "What is this?" he asked, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Who are you?" But the woman only shook her head slightly, as though names could wait and explanations would not keep the children warm. She stepped forward, her movements slow and careful, and for a heartbeat he thought she might collapse on his doorstep. The children followed, their small feet crunching against the frozen ground. Instinct overruled hesitation. He opened the door wider and stepped back, letting the warm breath of the fire spill into the night. The woman guided the children inside, her shoulders sagging with relief as the door closed behind them. The rancher watched as the boy's eyes darted around the room, taking in the plain table, the cast-iron stove, the few simple chairs. The girl clutched her bundle tighter, her breath forming tiny clouds in the warm air. The woman moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the heat while keeping the children close. She looked smaller now, the lamplight revealing the exhaustion etched into her face, but her voice remained steady. "I wouldn't have come if there was another way," she said quietly, "but there isn't." The rancher felt the questions rising like a storm inside him. Who was this woman? Why had she come to his door in the dead of night? And what could she possibly mean by those first words? Asterisk, "They ain't yours, but they need you." Yet even as the questions formed, Another truth settled in his chest. Whoever they were, they had nowhere else to go, and for tonight at least, they were his responsibility. The fire crackled louder, as if to seal the unspoken agreement, and the wind outside carried the sound of a world that had just begun to change. The rancher stood for a long moment, the door still humming from the slam of the wind, before he found his voice again. He set the iron latch and turned toward the three strangers now gathered near his fire. The woman's shawl slipped from her shoulders as the heat touched her skin, revealing the deep weariness in her posture. Her eyes moved over the room, noting the patched curtains, the rough-hewn table, the rifle resting against the wall. She held herself upright, but he could see the tremor in her hands as she reached to steady the youngest child. The boy leaned into her side, his eyes never leaving the rancher's face, while the little girl remained tucked behind her mother's skirt, clutching that small cloth bundle like it was a lifeline. He cleared his throat, the sound breaking the fragile quiet. "You came a long way in this cold," he said, not quite a question. The woman nodded once, her gaze steady but shadowed. "The roads are empty this time of night," she answered, her voice rough as though she had not spoken much in days. "Empty doesn't mean safe." The rancher pulled a second chair closer to the fire and gestured toward it. "Sit," he said simply. She hesitated, then eased herself down, keeping one hand on the boy's shoulder. The children remained standing, their wide eyes tracking every movement in the room. He noticed their thin coats, the worn edges of their boots, the way their cheeks burned from the cold. Whoever they were, they had been walking for hours, maybe longer. He reached for the kettle hanging near the fire, poured hot water into a tin cup, and slid it across the table. Steam rose in soft curls between them. "Warm yourself," he said, his voice softer now. She accepted the cup with a small nod of thanks, wrapping both hands around it as if to absorb every bit of heat. The boy shifted closer to the flames, holding his palms out cautiously. The girl peeked from behind her mother's arm, her eyes catching the glow of the firelight. For a moment, none of them spoke. Only the crackle of burning wood filled the cabin, and the low moan of wind against the shutters reminded them of the cold waiting outside. Finally, he broke the silence. "You said they ain't mine," he began carefully, "but they need me. You need to tell me what that means." The woman stared into the steaming cup, as if searching for the right words in the rising mist. "Their father, he's gone," she said quietly, "taken by a sickness that swept through before the harvest. We buried him before the first snow." Her voice wavered but did not break. "I held on as long as I could, but the farm was taken, debts we couldn't pay. There was no one left who would take us in." The rancher felt the weight of her words settle like heavy snow. He had seen hardship before, crops lost to drought, families driven off land they'd worked for generations. But something in her steady, exhausted gaze held a deeper truth. This was not a woman looking for charity. This was a mother who had carried her children through cold miles and harsh nights because the alternative was unthinkable. The boy stepped forward then, his small voice cutting through the thick silence. "Mama said we had to keep walking," he said, his eyes fixed on the rancher. "She said we'd find someone who wouldn't turn us away." His words were simple, but they struck like a hammer against the rancher's chest. He glanced at the girl, who still clutched her bundle, and saw her nod almost imperceptibly, as if to confirm her brother's statement. He pulled another chair from the corner and set it beside the fire. "Come closer," he said gently to the children. "Warm yourselves." The boy obeyed, stepping carefully over the worn floorboards, while the girl followed after a brief hesitation. Their small figures seemed almost swallowed by the large, rough room, yet the heat of the fire wrapped around them like a fragile shield. He noticed the scuffed toes of the boy's boots and the loose thread on the girl's sleeve. Quiet evidence of journeys too long for children so young. The woman lifted her eyes to his, searching for judgment and finding none. "I know we've come uninvited," she said softly, "but I had to try. I couldn't let them face the winter alone." The rancher studied her face, the faint lines of worry etched deep by miles of walking and nights of uncertainty. Her coat was thin, her shoes damp, but her eyes held a fierce resolve that spoke of a mother's unbreakable will. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but inside the small cabin the fire burned stronger. The rancher poured 2 more cups of hot water, sliding them toward the children. They accepted the warmth with shy gratitude, their small fingers curling around the tin like they feared it might disappear. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the familiar creak of wood beneath him, and let the reality of the moment settle in. His home, once a place of silence and order, now held the quiet breathing of 3 strangers whose lives had crossed his doorstep without warning. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, the weight of their presence filled the room with a strange and undeniable purpose. The warmth of the fire began to soften the chill that clung to their clothes, but the weight of the woman's words lingered in the room like a heavy shadow. The rancher sat back, hands resting on his knees, studying the small family gathered around his hearth. The boy sipped carefully from the tin cup, eyes darting between his mother and their silent host. The girl held her cup in both hands but barely drank, her gaze fixed on the flames as if afraid that looking away might cause the fragile comfort to vanish. Their mother sat upright despite her exhaustion, a quiet strength in the way she kept a protective arm around both children, even as the heat worked its way into her bones. Caleb, the name the woman had offered at last, broke the silence with a question that carried more weight than he intended. "How far have you walked?" She lifted her eyes, meeting his with a calm that belied the miles etched into her face. 3 days, she said softly. "From the old Harriman place past the dry creek. I thought if we kept moving, someone might." Her voice faltered for the first time, and she pressed her lips together before continuing. "I hoped someone would help before the cold finished what hunger started." Caleb felt a tightness in his chest. He knew the Harriman land. It lay nearly 20 miles away, a stretch of lonely prairie with no shelter for travelers. 3 days in the bitter wind with children, this small meant nights spent beneath the open sky, nights where a single mistake could mean death. He glanced at the boy, whose boots were cracked from wear, and at the girl, whose cheeks still burned with the sting of cold. "You're lucky you made it this far," he said quietly. "The storms come fast this time of year." The woman nodded, her eyes lowering to the children. "Luck," she murmured, "and stubbornness. Their father always said I had more of that than sense." A faint, fleeting smile touched her lips before fading like smoke. Caleb caught the shadow that crossed her face and sensed the memories pressing at the edges of her composure. He didn't press her for details, but the silence between them carried the unspoken truth of loss. He rose and crossed the small cabin to the cupboard, retrieving a loaf of bread and a jar of honey. The simple act of setting food on the table broke some invisible barrier. The children perked up, eyes widening at the sight of real sustenance. Caleb sliced the bread and passed it to the boy first, who accepted it with a quiet thank you that barely reached above a whisper. The girl followed, clutching her piece as though it were treasure. Their mother watched, gratitude flickering in her tired eyes, though she waited until the children had taken their first bites before accepting a slice for herself. As they ate, Caleb leaned against the counter, arms folded, and studied the woman with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect. She had not begged, had not wept, had not tried to soften her story with pleading. Instead, she had brought her children through cold and distance with nothing but resolve and the belief that somewhere a door might open. He recognized that kind of courage, the kind that survives in silence. The boy finished his bread and looked up at Caleb, his young voice breaking the quiet. "Mama says you were friends with my pa." The words caught Caleb off guard. He frowned slightly. "Your pa?" The woman looked at her son, then back at Caleb, her expression guarded. "His name was Robert Mayfield," she said slowly. "He worked cattle with you years back, before the fever took him." Caleb's mind flashed to long days on the range, to a wiry man with a quick smile and a stronger handshake. He remembered shared meals around a campfire and promises of better seasons. The memory struck deep, stirring a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Robert," he said softly, the name tasting of dust and distant summers. I remember. The woman's eyes softened at his recognition. Before he died, he told me if ever I was lost, if the children were in danger, I should find you. He said you were the one man he trusted. Her voice steadied as she spoke, but the weight of those final words filled the cabin with a new gravity. Caleb looked at the children again, seeing in their faces faint echoes of a man he once rode beside. The boy's determined set of jaw, the girl's quiet watchfulness. It was all there, small fragments of a friendship long past. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the shutters, a reminder of the prairie's unforgiving cold. Caleb moved to the stove and added another log to the fire, watching the sparks leap and settle. He felt the tight boundaries of his solitary life begin to shift, like ice breaking on a winter creek. He had built these walls to keep the world out, yet here sat the family of an old friend, their need undeniable, their presence reshaping the quiet he had guarded for so long. The woman set her empty cup on the table and met his gaze with a steadiness that carried both gratitude and expectation. "I don't ask for charity," she said firmly. "Only a place to rest, a chance to catch our breath. Tomorrow we can decide what comes next." Her words were simple, but beneath them lay the silent plea of a mother who had risked everything to protect her children. Caleb studied her face, the tired strength in her eyes, and felt a slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through the cold corners of his heart. The night outside deepened, but inside the cabin the fire burned bright, casting a gentle glow over 3 weary travelers and the man whose life had quietly begun to change. The fire settled into a steady glow, its quiet crackle filling the cabin with a soft rhythm that matched the slow breathing of the children. The boy had fallen asleep against his mother's arm, his small head resting on her shoulder, while the girl lay curled beside him with her cloth bundle clutched to her chest. Their faces, so recently pinched by cold and fear, now softened in the warmth, eyes fluttering in dreams. Caleb watched them from his chair, elbows resting on his knees, the flicker of lamplight casting long shadows across the walls. The room felt different now, no longer the silent refuge of a man who lived only for himself. It carried the sound of life, the fragile music of a family holding together against the night. The woman, Mary, as she had finally told him, shifted slightly to ease the weight of her sleeping children. Her eyes met Caleb's across the low table, steady but thoughtful. "I'm sorry to bring this to your door," she said in a low voice, careful not to wake the children. "I know what it means to have your peace broken." Caleb shook his head, the corners of his mouth tightening in a faint, almost reluctant smile. "Peace can be lonely," he replied. "Sometimes it needs breaking." Mary studied him for a moment, as though trying to read the truth behind his words. The firelight caught the lines etched by years of work and weather on his face. He seemed older than she had first thought, but there was a strength there that went beyond age, a quiet steadiness that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she and the children were not adrift. "Robert trusted you," she said softly. "He always said you were the kind of man who stood by his word." Caleb felt the name settle in his chest like a weight he both welcomed and feared. Memories rose unbidden. Long days of driving cattle across endless grass, nights of shared coffee under a canopy of stars, the laughter of a friend who never let hardship steal his warmth. "He was a good man," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Better than most." Mary's eyes softened, a brief light of affection and sorrow mingling there. "He thought the same of you," she replied. "When he got sick, he told me if anything happened, I should find you. Said you'd help, even if you didn't want to." Caleb gave a quiet exhale, part sigh and part acknowledgement. Robert's trust had crossed the years and now stood in his cabin in the shape of a widow and 2 children who carried the same stubborn spark he remembered from their father. The wind outside rose in a sudden gust, rattling the shutters and making the lantern flame dance. Mary glanced toward the door, her body tensing for a heartbeat before she forced herself to relax. Caleb noticed the small movement and read the fear behind it, the instinct of someone who had been forced to stay alert for too long. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "No one will bother you tonight." The certainty in his tone eased the tightness in her shoulders, though her eyes remained cautious. He rose quietly and fetched a spare quilt from the chest near his bed. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar, and the long summers it had spent folded away. He spread it over the children, tucking it gently beneath their chins. Mary watched the small gesture, her lips pressing together as if to keep unspoken words from escaping. Caleb returned to his chair and stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. For a long while neither of them spoke, yet the silence was not empty. It carried the weight of shared loss and the fragile beginnings of trust. After a time, Mary broke the quiet with a question so soft it barely carried across the table. "Do you live out here alone?" Caleb nodded. "Been that way for years. Neighbors are a good ride-off and I keep to myself." He glanced toward the sleeping children. "Didn't used to be this way. Life just turned." His voice held no bitterness, only the blunt honesty of a man who had stopped explaining himself long ago. Mary traced a finger along the rim of her cup, her eyes thoughtful. "Solitude can feel safe," she said, almost to herself, "until it starts to feel like a cage." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and saw the quiet strength behind her tired features. She had walked miles through cold and hunger, carried her children across an unforgiving land, and still her spirit remained unbroken. He felt a slow stirring inside him, a reminder of the man he had once been when friendship and trust were not things to be feared. The warmth of the fire reached deeper than his skin, seeping into the cold corners of a heart he thought long sealed. The night stretched on, the wind outside finally softening into a gentle hush. The children slept soundly, their small faces peaceful in the flickering light. Mary leaned back against the chair, eyelids heavy, but she refused to let sleep take her while Caleb remained awake. He noticed and spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of quiet assurance. "You can rest. I'll keep the fire strong." For a moment she hesitated, then allowed her eyes to close, trusting the simple promise of a man her husband had believed in. Caleb watched over them, the cabin filled with the subtle shift of a life opening to something unexpected, something that felt both dangerous and necessary, like the first thaw of spring after a long and bitter winter. Morning crept into the cabin in a slow gray wash, slipping through the cracks of the shutters and softening the hard edges of night. Caleb stirred first, his eyes opening to the faint glow that stretched across the wooden floorboards. The fire had burned low but still gave off a gentle warmth, a quiet reminder of the night that had passed without incident. He rose carefully from his chair, his boots making only a soft thud against the planks, and glanced toward the small bundle of blankets by the hearth. The children were still asleep beneath the quilt, their breathing steady and deep, while Mary sat upright in the chair opposite, eyes closed but posture alert, as if she had spent the night keeping watch even in her dreams. Caleb moved toward the stove, adding a fresh log to coax a brighter flame. The sudden crackle stirred Mary from her light sleep. She blinked against the morning light, her face marked by fatigue but calmer than the night before. For a moment neither spoke. They simply exchanged a quiet look that carried the shared knowledge of having survived something more than cold. Caleb poured water from the kettle into a pot and set it over the flames. "Coffee," he said simply, "and maybe some porridge if you don't mind plain food." Mary offered the faintest hint of a smile. "Plain food is a feast to us," she replied, her voice rough with sleep. The aroma of brewing coffee soon filled the small room, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke. The children began to stir, first the boy stretching with a small groan, then the girl rubbing sleep from her eyes while still clutching her bundle. Caleb watched them sit up slowly, their faces soft with the kind of innocence that comes only in the first moments of waking. He remembered mornings from his own childhood, simple meals, the smell of bread and fire, a mother's gentle touch, and felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself in years. He poured steaming cups and set them on the table, then ladled porridge into wooden bowls, adding a drizzle of honey for sweetness. The children approached shyly, their eyes widening at the sight of a warm meal waiting. Mary helped them settle at the table, smoothing their hair with a tenderness that made Caleb's chest tighten. The boy offered a quiet thank you before taking his first bite, while the girl giggled softly when the honey clung to her spoon. The sound, light and unexpected, filled the cabin with a warmth richer than any fire. Caleb found himself smiling without realizing it, the simple joy of their presence breaking through the walls he had built around his life. He ate in silence, listening to the small sounds of breakfast, the clink of spoons, the murmur of Mary's gentle reminders, the occasional soft laugh from the children, as if each note belonged to a song he had almost forgotten. After the meal, Caleb gathered plates and carried them to the wash basin, but Mary rose to join him. "Let me help," she insisted, taking a cloth from his hand. Their shoulders brushed as they worked side by side, a quiet rhythm forming in the small space. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving only the distant cry of a hawk and the faint creak of the porch boards. The world felt strangely still, as though it too was holding its breath. When the dishes were done, Caleb reached for his coat. "I need to tend the animals," he said. "You and the children stay inside where it's warm." Mary hesitated, then followed him to the door. "We'll help," she said, and there was no uncertainty in her tone. The children scrambled to pull on their small coats and boots, eager for a task after so many days of walking. Caleb considered arguing but thought better of it. He opened the door and let them step into the pale morning. The yard stretched wide under a sky streaked with silver clouds. Frost glittered on the fence rails, and the ground crunched beneath their boots. Caleb led them toward the small barn where his horse whickered softly at their approach. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of the animal, and he hurried forward with unguarded excitement. Caleb handed him a brush and showed him how to stroke the horse's coat in long, even lines. The boy followed every instruction with solemn concentration, the pride in his small face unmistakable. The girl clung to Mary's hand at first, but soon she too reached out to touch the horse's warm flank, her eyes widening in delight. Mary helped Caleb carry feed to the trough, her movements steady despite the lingering fatigue. He watched her lift the heavy sack with practiced strength, and he caught the determined set of her jaw. This was not a woman who waited for rescue. This was someone who had learned to endure, to work, to keep moving even when the world tried to break her. Caleb felt a deep respect stir within him, a recognition of courage that matched the rugged land they both inhabited. As the chores continued, the children's laughter began to fill the cold morning air. The boy giggled when the horse snorted warm breath onto his face, and the girl squealed as a curious barn cat wound around her ankles. Mary's eyes softened as she watched them, her hand resting briefly on the fence rail. Caleb caught her glance, and for a heartbeat their eyes held in quiet understanding. No words passed between them, yet the moment carried a promise neither dared to name. When the work was done, they returned to the cabin together, the children chattering about the horse and the cat as if they had discovered a secret world. Caleb held the door open and watched them step inside, their small boots scattering frost across the wooden floor. For years his home had been a place of silence, a fortress against the weight of old wounds. Now it echoed with voices and the sound of life, and he realized he did not mind the intrusion. The day stretched ahead, uncertain but bright, and he felt the first stirrings of something he had not allowed himself in a long time. The sense that his life might hold more than work and solitude, that the knock on his door had opened more than a night of shelter. The day wore on with a quiet rhythm, the kind that settles into a place after a storm has passed. Caleb repaired a loose hinge on the barn door while the boy fetched nails and handed them over one by one, his small face bright with the pride of helping. The girl followed Mary through the yard, carrying a basket as they gathered kindling for the evening fire. Their voices drifted through the crisp air, mingling with the gentle sounds of animals stirring in their pens. Each sound felt new to Caleb's ears, as though his land had been waiting all these years for the right people to wake it. By afternoon, the clouds broke, and a pale sun lit the prairie in soft gold. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the fence, watching the children chase one another across the yard. Their laughter carried across the open field, thin and sweet against the endless horizon. Mary approached quietly, the hem of her dress brushing against the frostbitten grass. She held a tin cup of water and offered it to him with a small smile. "You've been working since dawn," she said. "Take a rest before the night comes cold again." He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak sun overhead. They stood together in companionable silence, eyes following the children as they tumbled through the brittle weeds. Caleb noticed how Mary's shoulders had eased since the night before, the lines of fear around her eyes softening with each hour of safety. Yet beneath her calm he sensed a quiet tension, the awareness of a future still uncertain. "You'll need a plan," he said at last, his voice low. "Winter isn't for giving out here." Mary nodded, her gaze fixed on the children. "I know. I think of it every time I watch them sleep. But each mile we walked, I told myself to focus only on the next step. One step, one day. That's how we got here." Caleb studied her profile, the strength in her simple words striking deeper than any plea for help. "And now," he asked, "what's the next step?" Mary exhaled slowly, her breath a faint cloud in the cooling air. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I only know I can't keep running forever. They need a place where the ground feels steady again." Her eyes turned toward him, questioning but careful. Caleb held her gaze, understanding more than her words revealed. He knew the cost of wandering, the ache of rootless years. He also knew the fear of opening a door that might never close again. The children ran back, cheeks flushed and eyes sparkling with the thrill of play. The boy carried a small branch like a trophy, while the girl clutched a handful of dry grass for the evening fire. Caleb crouched to meet them, accepting their treasures with a grin that surprised even himself. "Fine work," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll make a ranch hand yet." The boy beamed, standing a little taller under the praise. Mary's eyes softened as she watched, the faintest hint of relief flickering across her face. As dusk approached, the prairie sky deepened into a tapestry of rose and violet. Caleb led the children back inside, where the fire already crackled in the stove. He set a pot of beans to warm while Mary helped the children wash the dust from their hands. The simple tasks unfolded with an ease that felt almost like memory, voices blending, footsteps crossing, the cabin filling with the soft sounds of shared life. Caleb found himself listening not just to the noise but to the spaces between, where trust and familiarity quietly grew. When supper was ready, they gathered around the table. The children ate heartily, their earlier shyness replaced by eager conversation. The boy recounted his adventure with the horse, his gestures wide and animated, while the girl whispered secrets about the barn cat that had followed them to the door. Mary laughed softly at their stories, the sound bright and unguarded. Caleb joined in with a chuckle of his own, surprised at how natural it felt to share a meal with voices other than his own. After the dishes were cleared, Caleb stepped outside to check the night sky. Stars pricked the darkness in sharp, cold points of light. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost, carrying a stillness that once had felt like loneliness but now hummed with quiet possibility. Behind him, the cabin glowed warmly, its windows spilling soft light across the yard. He could hear the faint murmur of Mary's voice as she coaxed the children toward their beds, her gentle words threading through the night like a lullaby. He lingered on the porch, staring out at the endless stretch of prairie. For years this land had been his refuge and his prison, a place where he could keep the world at arm's length. Now, with a single knock on his door, everything felt different. Inside that small cabin slept two children who carried the trust of a man he once called a friend, and a woman whose quiet courage had crossed miles of cold to find a safe harbor. Caleb felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, not as a burden but as a calling that reached beyond the solitary life he had chosen. The door creaked softly, and Mary stepped out, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. She joined him without a word, standing shoulder to shoulder as they gazed across the starlit plain. The silence between them was gentle, filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had both known loss and still dared to hope. Caleb glanced at her, catching the reflection of starlight in her eyes, and felt the faint stir of something new, something fragile yet strong enough to stand against the cold. The night stretched wide around them, but for the first time in years, he did not feel alone.